The next panel session is really looking at the outlook on the markets. Last week in Brussels, the forum held its first Outlook conference, really, looking at the economic data that we're finding in food and agriculture and energy, and what that also meant in terms of implications for policy analysis. And to set the scene from a global context and share with you some of the insights and data that we had at the conference last week, again, we are privileged to have with us Tassos Haniotis. Many of you will know Tassos from his time in the EU institutions. There's few more experienced or better equipped to take this subject on. We were delighted to have Tassos join the forum's advisory council that we set up in the spring of this year. And I'm now going to give him the floor to share with us his perspective from a global context. And then we will, of course, invite our panelists up to look at it from a European and perhaps a Central and Eastern European perspective in particular. Tassos, give him a warm welcome. The floor is yours.
Martin, it's a privilege and it's a pleasure to be back. I don't come often to Poland, but every time I come, Poland has changed to the better. It's much more advanced than I've seen it in the past. I wish I could say the same thing for the rest of the world in the picture I'm going to present right now. But what I would try to do is bring you a little bit closer to the global picture of the type of challenges I have seen. It's up to you to put the rock in the hard place wherever you feel in this discussion. But what I had in mind is the common agricultural policy and how it's being squeezed more and more from different points and angles, and where it fits in the big picture. So what I will try to do, and I'll try to go a little bit fast, what I will try to do is focus on the highlights of the OECD FAO market outlook, on the big picture as I presented. Actually, the numbers they have given to us go to 2040. The uncertainties that impact the EU's agricultural and some personal thoughts. Now that it's 2.5 years since I retired from the Commission, I can have my personal thoughts also reflected more openly in the public on what I call the suspended step of the farm to fork. And really, I feel it's a suspended step. We have no clear view of where it's going to go and where it fits in the overall CAP prospects. Now, so the markets are changing, and they're changing rapidly. And what does the OECD and FAO say? The first thing they say is that when it comes to the production landscape, we do expect strong growth when it comes to feed and fuel, rather lower growth in the food areas of agriculture, and sort of stagnation in the fiber production, the 4 Fs of agriculture, for those following the English jargon of the markets. Many players in food commodities, much fewer players when it comes to feeds, including soybeans, and trade increasingly covers the deficits that will be emerging, and as you will see in a couple of graphs, mainly focusing on Africa and Southeast Asia. The livestock and the feed growth is driven by income growth, especially in Asia. When it comes to wheat and rice, the basic food commodities, it's population that actually drives demand there. When it comes on the consumption landscape, Asia and Africa account somewhere between 50 and 75% of global consumption. We have the tendency sometimes to discuss as if we're the center of the universe. We're not. China's demand is slowing down as a result of a slowdown in income growth, but also, and mainly, as a result of stagnation in population. India, Southeast Asia, and Africa increased demand strongly, driven by a combination of income and especially in Africa, population growth that is still above 2% annually. And OECD is losing consumption share everywhere, the result of both population slow growth, but also changes in dietary patterns. And when it comes to trade and global tensions, disturb trade. The Russian invasion in Ukraine is the example of examples, but there are other tensions, some of them also forgotten sometimes from us, like what is happening in the Sahel region of sub-Saharan Africa, and the massive impact potentially it has for Europe. Food security risks are often underestimated, so is the role of trade, although more and more now food security and security, global security, come closer to the minds of people. What the Director General said before is very clear indication. And we have gone through a polarization period between either climate change action and food security, treating them as substitutes while they're really complements. Both are global problems that require parallel solutions. The wheat outlook reflects major shifts in past trends, and I focused on wheat because for me it's the food security par excellence. This is a complex graph, and I go slowly. Here, what I have done is I've looked for 20 years, the cumulative change from 2000 to 2020. These are real numbers that we know, and grouping the several players, EU and the US are the traditional monsters in the past in this market, not anymore. Very slight change of the global surplus. That's the difference between production and consumption, and somewhere I need to be reminded to put it in the graph. Australia, Canada, and Argentina have increased by 8 million metric tons cumulatively their export, the difference, their surplus. Brazil, China, and India are pretty much where they were, not major changes. The big change in the past 20 years has been Russia and Ukraine together, plus almost over 50 million metric tons of excess surplus over this period. And that managed to cover the increase in the deficit of Africa, the rest of Latin America, very small parts, and the rest of Asia. If you look into the next 20 years, this is what OECD and FAO are expecting. They are expecting essentially a growth in the surplus of EU, US, Australia, Canada, and Argentina, almost 30 million metric tons more surplus in the traditional exporters, another 24 million coming from mainly Russia. Ukraine is losing 5 million metric tons of wheat, and almost 50 million increase in the deficit of Africa and the rest of Asia, and you can see that in the graph. So that's the traditional exporters. I have to admit, I do not see where the European Union, Canada, and Argentina are going to find this additional wheat. This is what is expected to happen between Russia and Ukraine, where essentially you see a picture where Russia is feeding the world when it comes to wheat. And this is where all these additional needs are expected to be, which is mainly in Africa and the rest of Asia. We have had discussions in some internal meetings of OECD and FAO, where is this land essentially going to come from? And this yield, there are too optimistic picture both for the traditional exporters mainly. I think this is important because if it doesn't materialize, there's going to be a higher pressure for world market prices for wheat, and also more pressure for the deficit countries. A look into what are expected land use changes. Again, more land expected to be found in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is possible in some in Latin America if there is more investment. And that's a big question mark, whether this will materialize or not. And when it comes to expected emissions, what you have on the vertical axis is the annual change in greenhouse gas emissions, annual percentage change for the next 10 years, and on the horizontal axis is the annual change in the level of production. So essentially, in this light blue part, you see the only part in the world, and that's Europe plus Central Asia, that is producing more with less. And if you focus only in the EU is producing much more with less. It's the only major agricultural in the world that has managed to increase agricultural production and lower emissions. And one of the paradoxes in the debate we have about the common agricultural policy is in this tendency of self-flagellation we have in Europe, we tend to forget about this element. And you see it much more clearly here in a crucial sector for the European Union, and also one of the most dynamically growing sectors for Poland, which is the dairy sector. So on the left-hand side, you have those parts of the world where the herd is expected to go down, the dairy herd, but production and productivity and yields grow everywhere. And the European Union stands clearly as the most productive part, combining both growth in yields and reduction in emissions indirectly, because less cows means less methane emissions, even before accounting for changes in technologies, in feeding practices, and the rest. And on the right-hand side, you see those where an increase in production and yields is combined with an increase in emissions. Now, where does this picture lead us in terms of global uncertainties and EU worries? First of all, in terms of food inflation. Food inflation turned into a global problem with a huge gap between producer and consumer prices and distorted price signals. There are a couple of graphs that I have later on, and I will focus on those graphs. One thing I want to raise already here, what has happened with food inflation in post-COVID is unexplainable from the basic factors we knew before. There are things that you would have expected that would have explained why food prices went up, but not to this extent. And I think it will become evident in the later graph. Same thing in terms of EU energy price uncertainty. Most of the focus when we discuss, especially as economists, is still crude oil. Crude oil doesn't play the role it played before. Natural gas plays the important role, and that complicates the EU's green transition because of our dependence on natural gas. It has a direct impact on higher fertilizer prices, which acts both as an incentive to do things better, but there's a disincentive because prices went up too much. And there is a potential, this potential impact on nitrogen fertilizer complicates choices on best practices. Now, there is also, and I mentioned before, an impact from geostrategic tensions, whether it is the Ukraine and the differentiating wheat importer sourcing, the tensions in sub-Saharan Africa, and also the energy and raw material dependence that we have in Europe that turns the geostrategic tensions very acute and also has implications in changes in trade flows. Some graphs to point at everything that is line is actually at the commodity level. So what you have is agricultural in green, energy in red, fertilizers in purple. What you have is co-movement on commodity prices, a lot of volatility, and a higher level than what we have been used. Especially for agriculture, that's important, because those of us that are economists grew up in economics learning of the long-term downward trend in agricultural prices. This is over, but other things are also over, and there is a squeeze still in terms of the terms of trade for agriculture. And what is the dotted line? These are the world food consumer prices and the world consumer price index. And food prices have gone higher than the overall inflation. And what we also see is that we have had commodity producer price ups and downs in the past, but we have never had the acceleration in food consumer prices that we have seen recently. You had COVID and the asymmetric exit for COVID. You had the energy pressure and the tensions already in the summer of 2021, and you had the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Every one of those gave a boost to higher food inflation. But is that explained by this graph? I have my doubts. And as you can see here, on the left-hand side is core inflation, inflation without energy and food. In the middle is the headline inflation, and on the right is food inflation. And no matter which part of the world you look at, everywhere the same thing happened. The only problem we have is that the blue, we have the European Union, and we have had much higher pressures on inflation than the red is the US. It played a major role in elections, but yet it's only half of the pressure we had in Europe. And a couple of graphs on energy. This is pretty technical, but if you look at the consumption-weighted use of energy, so you take into account the increase in the natural gas, the prices of energy went even higher than the simple average that the World Bank has looked. So the red is with a trade-weighted. And here is the disadvantage of Europe in blue compared to the US. Imagine that you're a fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer producer. 70% of your cost is natural gas. It's 4 times higher in Europe than in the US to produce the same product. So where does this leave us in terms of the policy debate? Because my feeling is that the world has changed dramatically. The policy debate hasn't really changed that much. So, and I think we have to ask ourselves 3 questions in Europe. First of all, who is afraid of productivity? For quite some time, we have confused productivity with productivism and considered that we need to focus on less production, as if what we produce in Europe is the only thing that matters, and what are the global needs, and not what are the global needs. So sustainable productivity growth implies clearly that you can increase your output and reduce your environmental footprint. And this is something that is coming more and more from best practices. Where it's not coming is in the communication we do about what these practices do. Second, something that we have to ask ourselves in Europe, and now they have to ask themselves in the US as well, especially if Robert Kennedy becomes the Secretary of Health. What's the role of science? Because we have this kind of schizophrenic approach to treat human and animal health differently than plant health when it comes to applications of biotechnology. And Europe paid a price on that, a price of a whole generation of researchers that left to do the research in other parts of the world than here, and we ended up having a debate whether to accept Nobel-winning technologies in our day-to-day practices. And finally, who is afraid of trade? Because if we need to cover these growing deficits, trade is going to play a major role. And there is an issue here about trade that people forget, that actually trade increases everywhere overall welfare, but what we learn in first year textbook of trade courses is that what you have to do is have mechanisms whereby the winners compensate the losers. And sometimes agriculture is forgotten in this type of debate. What is clearly the case is in all the discussions we have had and all the analysis we have had on trade agreements in the European Union, there was always a fear about what they will do, and the end result has always been way much better than expected. So very briefly on the CAP and why do I use this rock in the hard place, there is a characteristic about a common agricultural policy that always attracts attention, and attention much more to the weaknesses than actually to the strong points. And this is the fact that it is a big part of a very small budget. From the 50% of GDP that goes to public expenditure in Europe, the 1% of GDP or 2% of total expenditure is expenditure on agriculture. This is neither a lot nor a little. The important thing is to focus on what you do with this money, but the focus is on this money and other type of policies that want to actually get and reap these benefits. In the Common Agricultural Policy, and I've spent 33 years of my career in the Commission, what I've seen is the CAP over 3 types of periods. The first one was very defensive. We like to call it a victim of its success. It was actually a victim of its initial design, a policy with total protection at the borders that started subsidizing exports because the initial EU, European communities, was 6 member states with food deficits. We've gone into a period where successive reforms made us much more confident about ourselves, but we have been in the last 10 years looking what to do and feeling rather insecure. And that is happening while at the same time, the world agri-food systems have changed dramatically, and the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork linked the CAP into these transition requirements, but it did it, in my personal view, with a major mistake. We set targets where we should have not set targets. And this is not an issue of the Farm to Fork or the Green Deal, it's an issue of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. People have the tendency to set a 50% reduction everywhere because it sounds nice and round, without solid analysis. And I remember, and I've written about that in an article on LinkedIn, one scientist, soil scientist, saying, if we get half of what we want for, we are happy. And what I told him is, do you listen what you say? 50% achieving a target is a major policy failure in any political debate. And that's the price, I think, that we're paying unnecessarily. So the first question about the future of the CAP is what we do with direct payments. And I've said here 3 dilemmas without concrete answers. The first dilemma, public money only for public goods. My position has always been that you need public money also for the failure in the markets of private goods, and food inflation is a typical example. But this is one of the issues that will dominate the debate about the future of direct payments. The second one is, do we accept that there is a joint delivery in the economic and the environmental outputs of agriculture? OECD already had a paper in 2007 focusing on that. Many years after, we're still debating about it. The issue is very much linked on whether, to the previous question, on whether we cover all land with some conditionality or only focus on the part of land that will get the public money for the public goods. And the third big dilemma is how gradual should the path of adjusting or abolishing direct payments would be. And if we really want to avoid the debt crisis, we have to take into account in this transition a redistribution that focuses also on the opportunity costs of land and labor, which are not the same, not only in all member states, but even within member states, you have differences. And there is a set of questions that will pop up and, in my view, will not actually focus a debate that is in the beginning. It's a better targeting of support, what to measure in terms of the CAP impact, and the balance between national and EU interests. That, in my view, will be the most dominant questions. And then a couple of issues on whether we really want to stop structural change in agriculture. The number of farmers today is smaller than what it was 10 years ago, and it's bigger than what it will be 10 years from now. We cannot stop that. The real question is, what type of dynamic economies are we going to have in rural areas that will help the remaining farmers and also the rest of the economy there? I focus on whether area or whether we should cover part or not of area, and that's my last slide now on trying to link the EU agriculture to global issues. The first thing is where we go from the farm to fork into the new vision. Frankly, in 100 papers without a number, I don't see a clear picture of where the next vision of EU agriculture is going to be. But we have 3 months or 100 days to wait and find that out. what we expect from the fork side of the farm to fork is very important, because farmers need to see signals coming from the consumer side to be able to make the necessary adjustments. The long-term prospects for price developments is very much linked to that. It's one thing to tell consumers that food production doesn't take externalities into account. It's another thing to go and tell them, you know, you have to spend even more for food to take account of externalities when food prices have gone through the roof. What impact on EU agriculture will have from the energy transition, especially in terms of the fertilizer industry? And that's very important, because it's one thing to use bulk fertilizer and talk about best practices, another thing to use the most sophisticated type of targeted fertilization, which also is more expensive and much more linked to the natural gas situation. What impact are we going to have with this global realignment of forces that also affects trade flows in a manner that brings security considerations much closer to food security, and Africa, and the potential massive outflow of people from Africa is what comes to mind. And finally, how does the CAP policy debate adapt to a dramatically changed world environment? I talk about the narrative of the Paris Agreement. Jerzy Pleva was my Director General when we signed the Paris Agreement. He's not my Director General anymore, but we still talk about agriculture and the Common Agricultural Policy. I'm not sure that we have adjusted our narrative to the new world we're facing, and that's what I tried to present right here. Maybe I raised more questions than answers, but that's what I had to say, and thank you for your attention.
Very good. Tassos, come and sit down here so we can bring the panelists in. Just before we do that, I want to make a link between what you've presented there and what we also heard from Boguslav a few moments ago. You described in a pretty compelling way that Europe has demonstrated how to produce more with less. And yet you have a slide up there that shows that commodity prices have been relatively stable whilst food price inflation has gone up. I mean, doesn't that say to us that our farmers are doing an absolutely incredible job and yet not getting the financial rewards that they should be, which is why they were in the street? Are they not justified for that?
I'm not sure why exactly they were in the street. My feeling is, because, I mean, farmers have been in the street in previous reforms we have made, and farmers will always complain for something. I'm a city boy, by the way, that have grown accustomed and also very respectful of what I see with agriculture. And I think farmers are in the streets for something that's very characteristic of the farming sector. This is a lifetime investment. And there is always worries about what is happening. So when they go in the streets, they know that they guarantee the collateral for their loan in the bank is exactly the level of direct payments they're going to get. So when there are questions about the future of direct payments, the first thing that they know, and most of the other people don't know, is that there is a potential for land prices to collapse, their asset values to collapse, and have a debt crisis, similar to what happened in the 80s, early 80s in the US agriculture. Now, my feeling is that the last demonstrations we saw about farmers has a lot to do with the fact that they didn't see any recognition about what they were doing. We moved into the COVID situation with a mentality before COVID that the food system is broke, really. And then you got through COVID, and you had all the sectors in the economy collapsing except the food system. That's not a system that is broke. This is a system that has a very high level of sophistication, of logistical links, and of the capacity to adjust to what it has in front of it. Then you have all this continuous pressure. Okay, we have to go to net zero. Zero. Of what? Nobody explains to people, and you hear it more and more often now, by 2040, emissions from agriculture are going to be 40%. And this is unacceptable. Why is it unacceptable? If we are successful with net zero, emissions from agriculture should be 100%. And it's not the absolute level of emissions that counts. It's not the percentage, it's the absolute level. And we're doing very well, thank you, in terms of reducing emissions. All the other sectors should go to net zero. And agriculture is going to be the only sector that would still, because of photosynthesis, sink carbon and emit carbon. Forestry should have the characteristics of sinking only. And now we see more and more that we might not achieve that because of diseases and because of fires. Now, we're facing an extremely complex transition in which all the solutions were coming from magical technological advances, and all the problems were coming from agriculture. And my feeling is this is what led farmers to actually demonstrate and complain, because we ended up proposing things that most of the people that proposed them, if you talk to them privately, they didn't believe that these things were going to be successful.
Hugely interesting. Lots to get into there.